Welcome back. This week, our investigative team has uncovered a serious child sex assault investigation against a Madison Baptist pastor. An investigation with findings so serious, the state pulled his child care license permanently. This pastor, Bob Stein, was also the president of the Minnesota-Wisconsin Baptist Convention for years until he quietly resigned in May. That was according to follow-up reporting from the Religious News Service. Now, the story is one that highlights a much bigger investigative series that the Houston Chronicle published in 2019, uncovering hundreds of abuse victims within the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I am joined by Robert Downen. He is currently with the Texas Tribune, but he was the driving reporter behind that series at the Houston Chronicle at the time. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start by, for viewers unfamiliar with the series who may not live in Texas, can you start by giving the headlines of what that year of reporting uncovered?
Yeah, so what we looked at was kind of this 20-year period between, really from 2000-ish to 2019. And that kind of was a perfect bookend between for 2008, when the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, declined to take up a lot of reforms that abuse survivors had been asking for years. And what we found is that in that 20-year period, something like 400 Southern Baptist pastors and volunteers had been criminally charged or credibly accused, nearly all of them criminal convictions for sex crimes ranging from, child sexual abuse to online, production or ownership of child pornography, to just a slew of different sex crimes. And moreover, what we found is that the SBC's kind of decentralized structure really kind of enabled a lot of people to be accused and then just move on to another church, sometimes as close as, just a few blocks away, and abuse again.
So that's massive reporting. It's essentially, for the Southern Baptist Convention, what the Boston Globe, their Spotlight team, did for the Catholic Church way back in the 90s. Tell me what happened within the SBC after that series published.
Sure. So it's been kind of an ongoing, response. In the initial wake, one of the first things that the SBC did was that they amended their constitution to stipulate that you can no longer be what's called in friendly cooperation with the rest of the convention, aka a member of the convention, if you do have a known sexual predator, or convicted sexual predator on staff. Prior to our reporting, the biggest stipulations to be a member of the SBC were that as long as you gave money, you agreed along or with the general theological stances of the denomination and didn't affirm or endorse homosexuality or have female pastors, you were kind of considered, a member. And so what our reporting did was got them to add in addition to the female or, gay pastors thing or affirming of homosexuality rather, to add that you can't have a convicted sex offender on staff. Now, since then, there's been a number of kind of a piecemeal approach to the problem. They've done some curriculum, they've done, produced a number of resources, but they've also more recently, in 2022, released an audit of their executive committee, the leadership body, that found for 20 plus years, the leaders of the SBC had really been, a small group of leaders had been suppressing the reports of abuse survivors about the extent of the abuse crisis in the denomination, and also kind of knowingly misleading the broader SBC about the extent of the problem because they feared lawsuits would arise. And then so after that, what the SBC did was they created a reform that had long been sought by survivors, which is basically this database that SBC churches can consult when making hiring decisions, that basically shows if a person has been accused or convicted of a crime. The argument for that being that because there's no real standards for ordination, no real communication between a lot of these SBC churches, it's kind of a, what's been described to me as a porous sieve of a denomination that allows abusers, as I said, to kind of just move from place to place and abuse at will.
So this church I'm reporting on, obviously, is Southern Baptist affiliated. So let me tell you a little bit of a story before I ask my next question. So when I called the local Baptist association in Southern Wisconsin that Bob Stein's church is affiliated with, they didn't have any interest in commenting on the story. They didn't want to talk about the problem. My biggest question was who obviously has the authority here to tell him, hey, I reported he had kept preaching. Maybe you don't do that when facing this type of investigation. And I actually had to go, obviously, to a religious professor, Curtis Freeman, to get information for our viewers about how the SBC works and how it was possible for Stein to keep preaching. So I'm setting this question up with that for a reason. No, knowing all this, does it feel to you that there is truly been headway, or is it a bit of a mixed bag when this is still the response I'm getting to this type of reporting within the SBC?
I mean, I think that it has definitely been a mixed bag. There are definitely some positive steps that have been made towards, combating the problem. But even as SPC leaders will admit, like the things that they've done so far are really just the very basic first steps. And combating the SPC's abuse problem is going to require not just a lot more sweeping reforms, but also a broader culture shift in a denomination of something like 14 million and people and 47,000 churches. Now, as to the response that you got, I think that it's a very common response that you hear in SBC world. It's this idea of local church autonomy that is kind of the bedrock of the faith that says, we cooperate. We are a convention of cooperating churches, but like you don't get into my business, I don't get in yours, and you don't have power over what happens in my church, even when it comes to hiring decisions.
I think it's very rare when reporting like yours prompts a response that now 4 years later is continuing to develop and continuing to evolve. So I think there's encouraging signs as well, wouldn't you say?
I think so, yes, but I think it really, again, I think that and this is not something. This isn't an opinion. This is something SBC leaders have been saying since we started our reporting, that like, yes, there have been positive steps made, but at the same time, the SBC for decades fought this problem and pretended themselves immune to it. After the Catholic Church scandal happened, they penned so many columns and talked so openly about how they were immune to this because pastors were people's parents, and parents would never abuse kids, and blamed the Catholic Church's celibacy requirements for its abuse problem. And so when you think about it in the context of that kind of this decades long refusal to admit something that others were telling them as early as the early 2000s that were a problem, if you think about it in the context of that, I can understand why there are a lot of survivors and a lot of advocates for abuse reforms who look at what has happened in the SBC so far and say, yeah, okay, positive first steps, but like that if the first step is admitting there's a problem, we're barely there. So
Robert, thank you so much for talking about this.
thank you so much for having me.
All right, just after the break, the Supreme Court in Wisconsin has flipped control. What that means for the fired director of court systems, we're talking to him right after the break.